get in now. Yes. We're starting. Please take your seats. Everybody, please take your seats. We're starting now. And like I said last night, we don't want a lot of noise in the background when we're doing the live stream. So please get seated. And please come promptly. I know there's coffee down there, but please stay seated. It'll be too disturbing if you move around too much. So welcome this morning. Have a great day ahead of us. Just a couple of announcements. So at 11:30, there will be lunch, sandwiches, and stuff in the foyer. There will be coffee throughout the day, but please limit it to the breaks because, like I said, no disturbance. Last night, this phone was found in a charger down here, so anyone who's missing it can come to me. Okay, good. And yeah, so I want to present ARI's in-house philosopher, chief philosopher, Onkar Ghate, who's a brilliant speaker, but also one of the most people in the world with most knowledge about objectivism. So he's a senior fellow at Ayn Rand Institute, and I'm very happy to hand over the word to him.
Am I using that?
No, yeah.
Okay, how's the sound? Like that? Okay, I'm not used to using a handheld mic. Good morning and welcome. I'm glad we have such a great turnout for the conference. I think we're going to have an exciting 1.5 days today, so I hope you're looking forward to it. I am. We have, as Tal kind of polled the audience yesterday, we have a wide range of people. Some people very seasoned in knowledge of Ayn Rand and her philosophy, some people relatively new. In this talk, I'm trying to sort of kick off the conference, talk about some of the main themes of tribalism and individualism, particularly how Ayn Rand looks at these issues. I've tried to make it accessible to the relative newcomer, so if I've erred on the side of something, I've erred to make it more of an introduction than to get into the real depths of some of these issues. And the later talks will go into more depth about many of the issues that I'll touch on in this talk. So it's, as you see, it's individualism in an age of tribalism. And I'm going to start talking about tribalism. And this is, there's been a lot of kind of discussion, news articles, stories about the rise of tribalism in the West. So both in America, in the US, I'm from America. I think one of the incidents of the last 2 years that galvanized people in America that were witnessing some kind of real rise of tribalism was what happened in Charlottesville. So I'm actually from Virginia, so it was in my state, unfortunately. And that was a whole demonstration by what are called in the US white nationalists or white supremacists, marching in Charlottesville, so that's the home of Thomas Jefferson's university, and marching to preserve statues of the Confederacy, so statues that are memorializing slavery. And this was something that people did not expect in this day and age, this kind of political demonstration. And I think particularly the aftermath of it and how it was dealt with, including that you had a president who was excusing the actions and going on stage saying, well, there's good people in this demonstration. And these are people marching around with placards saying, Jews will not replace us, and so. And this was that, oh yeah, this is sort of normal, and it's, don't think all these people are bad, and so on. And there's been a lot of things like this, both politically, and Yaron will be in his talk talking much more about the political aspect of the rise of tribalism. There's also been, there's been, again in the US, but I think that Europe's witnessing similar kinds of things. There's been a lot of uproar, demonstrations, and so on campus. And people have a growing feeling that campuses, so university and colleges, are helping push people into tribal groups. So take just one kind of phenomenon in the US of the prevalence now of what they call hyphenated Americans. You're a Hispanic American, or you're an Asian American, or you're an African American. And this is putting people into what look like tribal groups, and this is what you're supposed to self-identify with. So there's been a lot of discussion. I think it's right. I mean, the discussion's right that we're witnessing a rise in tribalism. And I want to talk a little bit, start off with the way that Ayn Rand thinks about tribalism. So I've put, let's see if this is working. It's creating an us versus them mentality. I think that is part of the way to think about, and what people are worrying about is this kind of splitting up into groups that it's we win, you lose, and this whole atmosphere that it's that the competition now is a win-lose competition among rival groups or rival gangs. And this is a phenomenon that I think actually a lot of contemporary phenomenon, including something like in the US, Donald Trump. Ayn Rand, towards the end of her life, was writing about this kind of thing, that it's on the horizon, given the trends in the culture and in the world. What you're going to witness, now she died in 1982, but she's writing in the late 70s and early 80s, just before she dies. What you're going to witness is a rise of tribalism. So one of the, if you're interested in this issue, one of her essays that I think is very interesting for what it forecast is an essay called Global Balkanization. And she's writing about what we're witnessing is the world, and she thought of it as a worldwide phenomenon, or if we think of it as throughout Western culture, so in America and North America, in Europe, that we're witnessing a push towards thinking of oneself as a member of a tribe. and that global balkanization, I mean, is a metaphor that the world is splitting up into a more tribal atmosphere. And she thought it was a logical consequence of the ideas that were dominant and had been dominant for, you could say, at least a century and a half, if not more. And particularly, she thought of them as philosophical developments. I think my clicker is almost out of range. Oh, okay. Sorry about this. Okay, there we go. And two broad forces, and I think of them really as they're the forces that arise after the Enlightenment. So if we're looking at the other side of what tribalism is, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, about individualism. I think the real age of individualism is the age of Enlightenment, and then some of what flows into the 19th century. But it's when they were thinking in the age of Enlightenment, so the 17th and 18th centuries, that you should think of yourself as an individual capable of thinking for yourself and charting your own course in life. And the United States, which was, I think, really the last great product of the Enlightenment, was a country founded on these principles, that people can come, and they will come from all kinds of places throughout the world that are much more tribal, and they can come here and be individuals. And what you get then in the 19th and into the 20th century, Rand thought, you get two main kind of philosophical lines of attack against the Enlightenment. And one you can think of as these are her terms, so the forces of irrationalism and the forces of collectivism. And the irrationalism is, there's a real, in the 19th century, thinkers, and particularly philosophers, turn against the Enlightenment and the idea that an individual is capable of reasoning, of discovering knowledge for himself, that he's not really capable of that. And reason doesn't put you into contact with reality. You're not really able to know. And if you're to have any chance to have any kind of real contact with reality, any kind of real knowledge, you have to turn to things like intuition, emotion, instincts, will, it will often be put, and as against reason. So you have a real turning against reason in the 19th century. And there's one other aspect that is non-obvious that she puts into the category of irrationalism. And that's the advocacy of determinism. So the idea that you're a product of all kinds of antecedent factors, and they can be cashed out in different ways. You're a product of the family environment you were brought up in, you're a product of your genes. It can be cashed out in different ways, but this idea that you're a determined being, which is all over the place today, and I think one of the aspects that really pushes towards tribalism. This comes, you start getting more and more of this in the 19th and in the 20th century. And it's the idea that you don't really have choice. So the idea that you could be self-governing, to use one of the kind of terms that would be used in the Enlightenment, that was more and more thrown out the window. And there's a deep connection from Rand's perspective of free will and individualism. And this will be part of the theme of Ben Baer's talk tomorrow morning. And so as I said, there's going to be many talks that are going to flesh out more some of the issues that I'm raising here. So there's the forces of irrationalism, and there's the forces of collectivism, which, if the Enlightenment was focused on the individual, what you get in the 19th and 20th century is the rise of all kinds of doctrines, both moral and political, that push the idea that what really counts is the group, the collective in some form or another. And if you're thinking more politically of communism, socialism, fascism, they're all variations on extolling the group, and the individual doesn't really count. He's a cog in the machine, is one of the metaphors, as it will be put. So he doesn't count politically, and he doesn't really count morally. So in the 19th century, you get, for instance, the rise of utilitarianism, that it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Your whole focus is supposed to be on the group, the group's happiness. You should subordinate yourself to the group, and if what's necessary for the group's well-being is you sort of erase yourself out of existence, yeah, if you're able to do that kind of great moral, take that kind of great moral step, you should do it. So you get doctrines that are really pushing against individualism in the 19th century. And what's the connection of these to tribalism? Because they look from one view, from kind of one perspective, and they were often presented like this, as they're not splitting people into groups. This is a universal perspective that we're going to convince you of. Everyone can adopt socialism or communism. Here are our arguments. They should persuade you, and you should adopt these. So it's something that you should study, and if you think of all these kind of Marxist, socialist groups, I mean, incredible amount of literature that they're putting out in the 19th and 20th century. This looks like it's, yeah, well, this is about knowledge. We're going to convince everyone, and we're going to unite everyone into whatever, a socialist commune, into communism. But everyone should come to accept this. So it had a kind of universalist element to it, of not breaking people up into rival gangs or rival groups. At least that's how it was presented. And that it was about reason. And I mean, the Marxists talked about, well, ours is scientific socialism. Now, Rand thought, and I think certainly history bears this out, that this whole line, that it's really about convincing people, not forcing people, and that it's this universalist aspiration, we're going to have this one glorious kind of civilization, and if you know the kind of Marxist story, the dictatorship is going to wither away, and we're going to then have one great kind of utopia here on earth that everyone will live in. That, she thought, this is all fraudulent. So they present it like this, but it's all dressed up like this. This is not really the essence of what is going on. And the essence of what is going on is that what they were pushing, so what they were actually preaching and what they were actually pushing was tribalism. That if what's animating your whole doctrines and movements is you can't count on reason, you have to rely on some form of non-reason, this is the irrationalism, whether it's will, whether it's emotion, whether it's instincts or intuitions. That's what you have to rely on. And that you're preaching collectivism and that the individual is subordinate to the group. The only result of that is going to be tribalism. It's going to be breaking people up into rival gangs and rival groups. And she thought for a very definite reason. So I put up here a long quote, but I think it's more, this is from Global Balkanization, from that essay. If men accept the notion that the individual is helpless, so this is the idea that he can't reason for himself, he can't reach knowledge as an individual. So if he's helpless intellectually and then morally, and what collectivism is pushing is the individual's nothing, he can't do anything of himself, he needs morally to subordinate himself to the group. So if you accept the notion that the individual is helpless intellectually and morally, that he is nothing, but the group is all, and his only moral significance lies in selfless service to the group, they will be pulled obediently to join a group. But which group? And this, I think, is the key idea. Well, if you believe that you have no mind and no moral value, you cannot have the confidence to make choices. And then if you add to this the determinism, which is telling people, well, you don't even really have choice, but you're not going to have the confidence to make your own choice because you don't think you can rely on your own mind. And you're not supposed to be an individual making choices. You're supposed to subordinate yourself to the group. So if you can't make a choice like this, what are you going to do? If you can't have confidence to kind of make an individual decision, the only thing for you to do is join an unchosen group. The group into which you were born, the group to which you were predestined to belong. And the key, I mean, this is italicized in her essay, it's an unchosen group. That's what you will come to ally yourself with. And she thought, this is, when you look at what socialism and communism, for instance, do to people, this is what they do. They push people into rival groups and gangs, and it's a war of all against all. So the idea of, another way, if you want another metaphor, of dog eat dog that was said about capitalism and free market systems, she thought, no, if that's a description of anything, it's a description of communism and socialism, that people are tearing each other apart. I mean, you can see that in Venezuela. You either try to escape or you have to join some kind of gang, and it's you against them. It's the us versus them mentality. That this is what the doctrines of the 19th and 20th century really meant, and what they really do when they're embedded in a culture or in a nation or a culture. I mean, in a country. And so, towards the end of her life, as I say, she's writing about, this is what we're witnessing. We're witnessing a rise of tribalism. And so the way to think about it, I think, you can think of it as collectivism. It's an idea that the group is above the individual. But what it really is about, it's a certain kind of group, a tribal group. If it's unchosen characteristics that you're going to do, it's a group defined by physical, accidental, unchosen, non-intellectual characteristics. So you identify with your race, to take that you saw both in communism and in Nazism. You identify with your gender. There's all kinds of, you identify with your country. So you can put it, one way of capturing the kind of tribal mentality is my race or country or traditions or ancestors or gender or sex, but these are all, they're accidental, unchosen. It's the country I happen to be born in, the race that I happen to have. These are the groups that come to dominate, and that people think this is what, somehow my identity is connected to this kind of group membership. So it's a tribalism, it's a particular kind of group that people are being pushed into. And that this is a result of communism and wider of collectivism and of the preaching that the individual is incapable of really reaching knowledge. And that it's a crucial part of one's identity. This is, I think, also the key element to get that it's a rise of tribalism. It's not just an economic group or something like that. It's, you're being pushed towards groups that you're supposed to self-identify with and think that something essential about myself comes from the fact that I was born in Canada, or that I'm have a dark skin color, and so on. It's that, like, this is supposed to be something essential about your identity, and this is what is pushed a lot on college campuses, and we'll talk about that I think tomorrow when we talk, for instance, about multiculturalism. I think this is one aspect of the multiculturalist program, of pushing the idea that your personal identity is connected and intimately, essentially connected to the accidental, unchosen characteristics. This is a key idea of the tribalist mentality, I think. And that you're supposed to show loyalty to the tribe, in the end means you're being given orders about how you're supposed to think. This is the conclusions, ideas, and values you're supposed to have as a woman, or as a male, or as a Hispanic American. And so they're dictating. So there's a real authoritarianism here, which just is a different perspective on that there's a group that stands above the individual, and it's telling you what to think and what to value. And that we live in an age of tribalism, I mean, I think we really do, and that there's all these forces in the culture pushing this. It's one of the things that we're focused on in the conference is to talk about it at a kind of cultural level, at a political level, how we're being split up into tribes. But I think from a personal level, what one should really think about is that tribalism can exist in degrees. So it's not that you have to view yourself as like fully, I'm a member of this race, or what's crucial is I'm a citizen of Germany, and that's the kind of nationalism, and that my whole identity is involved in that. It's that when it gets really to the extreme, that is, I think, what tribalism looks like. But since the culture is pushing this, you can have elements of this in your own thinking and your own valuing that I think you should really try to be on guard against, and try to sort of inoculate yourself from. And that you really need to adopt an individualist perspective in order to do that. But I'll just give you two examples from my own life of the way that a kind of tribal perspective is pushed more and more in the culture, and in how you're being raised and how you're told to think about yourself. I'm Canadian, but I'm half German and half Indian. And I remember when I was growing up, I didn't go often back, or I wasn't really back because I wasn't born. I was born in Canada. But to see these two cultures that my parents came from, both have real tribal elements, and they push you to try to identify that there's something significant about the fact that you're German, and that there's you should think of your identity as somehow intimately connected to that. And I mean, you can get all kinds of really strange ideas, and then really evil ideas. I remember going back, this was probably mid-'80s, and talking to Germans and German relatives and so on. And you have good conversations. They seem like hard-working individuals. You're talking individual to individual. And then the discussion turned to some political things, and World War II and the rise of Nazism. And you get all of a sudden that they're making all kinds of excuses for why Germany voted for Hitler, and you have to understand what the situation was like. And you get the switch from, they're not really any longer concerned with what's right or wrong, true or false. It's now my country, right or wrong. And what they're defending is their German heritage and so on, because that's supposed to be crucial to their identity. So if they said anything bad about that, it would be something bad about themselves. And I mean, this is at the level of giving excuses for Hitler. But it's the kind of thing that they're pushed to think of their identity like that. In Indian culture, it's even more, I think, that in all kinds of ways, it pushes you to think like that. I remember going back, and it was, I was surprised that arranged marriages are still a thing. And that was the relatives said, I'm going to find you a nice Indian girl to get married to. And they don't even think of it as, like, this is really tribal. And they wouldn't occur to them to think, well, why not a nice German girl? Why does that side count and this side doesn't? They wouldn't think about that. Or why not just a nice girl? It's not the way they're thought, because it's a very tribal, collectivistic perspective. And it's easy to absorb this, I think, because there's all kinds of elements in the culture that are pushing towards this. So you can have it in a very extreme form, but you can have it in much lesser forms. And part of the issue about being an individual is the willingness to really challenge and to think about your own ideas. So the opposite of tribalism is a real individualism. And I put up here a scientist, because I think of this as a scientist is on the quest for reaching what's true, and this looks like a medical researcher, of reaching what's good, and of having a view of that is not tied to the group. So there's a real attempt to figure out what's true and what's good, and a real first-handed attempt. You're not going to subordinate your own mind, your own ideas, your own values to the group. So it's not my country right or wrong, or my nation right or wrong, or my sex right or wrong, or my race right or wrong. It's what's right or wrong, what's true or false. And then if there's some particular group that seems to be on the side of what I think is true and what I think is good, yeah, certainly you can join that. But you don't subordinate yourself to anything like this. So you don't subordinate yourself to any kind of group or collective. But to not subordinate yourself means to really think about these issues for myself and to put in the work to try to figure these things out, and at a very deep level. And that this is the path to the creation of a real personal identity. So not a personal identity that comes from outside forces, but a personal identity that you're creating and that you're generating. I put up here a personal identity it's about the content of your character. This is from the civil rights leader Martin Luther King in the US. He said that he doesn't want his children to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, I think obviously by the color of their skin, that's a tribal form of judgment. They have no control over that. But then the other perspective has to be, well, they do have control over the content of their character. Otherwise, it would just be another kind of thing that you've inherited from somewhere else. And what does it mean to say that you have control over the content of your character? Or to say that to put it a little differently, that you're the author of your character. I mean, so the perspective was he wants his kids to be judged by what they can control, what they have choice over, and not by things that they can't control and that they don't have choice over. But this again is bringing up the issue of, if you really don't have choice over the content of your character, then like isn't this just like any other feature? Why is it important to be judged by the content of your character? And so when one thinks about one's own personal identity, it should be about, I think, what are my ideas, what are my values, and particularly like what are my core or basic ideas and values? How do I face the world? What do I think about them, the world, and myself and my place in the world? That's how one should think about one's personal identity. But there are more sophisticated forms of tribalism that I think are harder to break out of. And these are what I want to turn to talk to, where they seem really wrapped up with one's own personal identity, and they are in a certain sense. And I think particularly of the forces of religion and of morality or conventional morality. I think one should think of these as by and large tribal phenomena, but they're not normally thought of as tribal phenomena. And it's normally a person will think, yeah, the fact that I'm a Catholic or Protestant or Hindu or Muslim, this is like really intimately tied to my personal identity. And so if I'm starting to think about that and to question this kind of thing, it seems like what I'm doing is questioning and trying to somehow uproot my own personal identity. And if individualism takes seriously me as an individual and my personal identity, isn't there some kind of conflict here? And I don't think there is a kind of conflict, but I think to really get that there's not a conflict, you have to have the perspective that your personal identity isn't even in the end of the day about the content of your ideas and values at some particular instant of time in your life, but rather of how you're reaching those ideas and values, so that your real personal identity, there's kind of a level underneath the particular ideas and values that I happen to hold right now. And some of these I might hold for good reasons because I've really thought them through, and some I might have absorbed from the wider culture in a more tribal kind of way. So tribalism in the end is, these are things I inherit, these are things that are passed down. And that's how I think much of religion and morality is like, which I'll talk about in a moment. And to be able to question this, you need a perspective on yourself that is deeper than it's just my beliefs in the here and now, or my ideas and values in the here and now. And this is the perspective that you get in the Fountainhead. So for those of you who, I've met some people last night who are in the process of reading the Fountainhead. If you're interested in individualism, particularly Rand's take on individualism, the Fountainhead is the book to read. Its theme is about individualism and the individual, and what it means to live a life where you really are first-handedly and actively focused on trying to figure out what's true and what's good. And you get a perspective there on what is myself. And it's the thing, it's put like this in the book, it's the thing within me that thinks, makes judgments, decides. It's not the particular judgments I've reached or the particular decisions I've made, but the thing within me that's able to do this. And you can come to a perspective that, well, yeah, I mean, some of my ideas, some of my values are wrong, and I think like deeply wrong, and I need to change them. And that's not you're attacking yourself. It's rather being true to yourself. If you have this perspective on yourself that deeper than the particular ideas or values I hold is the thing within me that's capable of thinking about these things, reaching judgments and making decisions on them. And if you go back to earlier in the talk, this is the issue of when she says where tribalism comes, it comes from irrationalism. What people more and more are taught is that you can't do this for yourself. You can't think in a deep, deep way about what's true and what's good. And so you have to look to some kind of outside force that's going to tell you these things, because you can't do it. But you can do it from the perspective of Rand and her philosophy. And you should do it if you're on a quest to become an individual, and that this is what individualism is about. And it's not the perspective of individualism, of independence in Rand's philosophy is not the way that this was put in the late 19th, early 20th century, is atomistic individualism. And the idea was everybody is this kind of atom that doesn't interact with anyone else. It lives a completely solitary life, does everything on their own. So it's like everyone is a self-sustaining farmer and so on. And that's what individualism and independence means. That obviously isn't true. You learn all kinds of things from other people. You want to be in all kinds of organizations. The division of labor, if you just think economically, is such an enormous boon. So that perspective isn't true. And the way that Ayn Rand put it is, you're not an atomistic individual. You're not part of a collective. Man is not a social animal. He's a contractual animal. And that means you have to really decide the groups that you're going to join. There's many, many times that it's extremely valuable to join different kinds of groups, whether you're going to college to get educated, you're joining a business, you're joining Microsoft or IBM or Apple. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons to be interconnected with people. But the huge difference is if you're choosing them, and you're choosing them based on your values and ideas versus they're in effect chosen or decided or determined for you. And that's the issue, that it's unchosen and it's deterministic. So this is the picture of individualism you get in from Rand and in objectivism. And its roots are very different from what was the dominant ideas in the 19th and 20th century, which I think have produced, as I've talked about, an age of tribalism. So now so I've talked a little bit about what I'm calling more sophisticated forms of tribalism, and these are my images for religion and conventional morality. And conventional morality just means the morality that sort of saturates in the culture that you grow up in, and that you're supposed to just absorb. And it seems like why would you put these as tribal phenomenon? Because they seem to be connected to ideas and values. There's, enormous amount of writing, both in all the major religious traditions, of these are what our doctrines mean, this is how to interpret them, this is how to practice them. This is where they come from. And the same in regard to conventional morality. There's a lot that is said, and it seems that there's a lot of ideas and a lot of arguments about these things. But I think in the end, that's not true. So just as Ayn Rand thought about the irrationalism and collectivism, and when it was presented as, look, this is about ideas, about arguments, we're going to unite everyone into a socialist utopia and so on. It's presented as it's not really tribal. It's not about things that are unchosen, not about things that you don't think and shouldn't think as true. And there's something similar in regard to religion and morality. They're sort of dressed up like that, but I think in the end, it's camouflage for what the real essence is. And again, I'll give you two examples from my own life. I think it's more clear in regard to religion that it, in the end, is a tribal phenomenon. So I was, I think about 10 or 11. And I went, so I was in Canada. I attended a French school that was sort of not super Catholic, but basically a Catholic school. And I remember a discussion when I'm present with the priest who came to give the religious lessons and the principal of the school. And they're debating what religion I am. And is he Catholic or is he Protestant? And they're having this debate conversation among the two of them. I'm standing there. And what doesn't occur to them to do? So it doesn't occur to them to ask me, right? It doesn't occur to them to ask, like, does he even understand what the doctrines of Catholicism are, or the doctrines of whatever strain of Protestant they thought I would be? And I'll tell you what I think they thought. They don't, like, does he even understand this? Is it too early to classify him as anything because he doesn't understand any of these doctrines? No, because it's not really about understanding the doctrines. It doesn't occur to them that I might be neither. It's like they've never heard of other religions, or maybe he's not even religious. And it's so, what they're asking in effect is, what did I inherit from my parents? And I think the basic deduction in there, the way they were grappling with it was, well, okay, he's half German, half Indian. We don't really know anything about Indian religions. And they came here to Canada, so maybe they don't like that. So it's not that. German, okay, they're Protestants, so maybe that's what he inherited. But he got sent to a Catholic school, so maybe they converted or something like that. And so it's got to be Protestant or Catholic. But it's a phenomenon that's inherited. And most of religion is like that. It's the young kids are supposed to inherit the religion of their parents. And that, in the end, is, I think it's essentially a tribal phenomenon. And so the idea that your personal identity is wrapped up in your religion, one should really think about that and think, is this just another tribal manifestation? Have I come to my religious beliefs because I really think they're true and they're good, and it comes from my own first-handed reasoning? Or is this something that's just it's a hand-me-down, in effect? And just that religion is like that it's really about, in the end, something inherited. I think the same is true of morality. It's a traditional inherited phenomenon. It's what you're supposed to think. And you're not really given a lot of reasons for why you're supposed to think. And typically what we live in now is it's some kind of version that the good is to live for other people. That's what morality is about. Everybody knows it. Why would you even think about questioning it? And so that people's moral thinking is largely tribal. This too, that I got this in school. So I got that in religion, like this is how it's approached. And I got this in regard to morality as well, the way people think about good and evil. That is, that they don't really think, a lot of people don't really think about this issue. This was in high school, and I remember, like, I wasn't very happy in high school, and the high school was essentially boring. I didn't go to a very good school, and it wasn't interesting. But it struck me as really weird. So I was in class, and sometimes I would skip class, but sometimes I'd go to a math class or English class, and I would be reading science fiction novel, and openly, I mean, in it, that not following the lessons. And the teachers they didn't care. And when they would ask, I would say basically, well, if you teach something I don't know, I'll listen. And it wasn't like, this was a bad school, so I wasn't some genius or something. It was a bad school. But what struck me is they didn't care. Like, this is a place of education. And here's someone who is interested in being educated, doesn't feel like he's being educated in the school, and they don't care. What does it mean this is a place of education? And I got the contrast. I mean, so it's not like everything was like this. When I was involved in sports, it was like I was on the second team volleyball. And the coaches, and I thought rightly, put most of the energy and so on into the first team of developing and training them. And this is a sports, and we're trying to get better. And it's a focus on really trying to get better. There wasn't anything like that, really, in the high school in regard to education. And sports was supposed to be extracurricular. The whole essence of it is supposed to be about education, and they didn't really value it. And then I got to thinking that, okay, so I have what I think they should be doing and what's good, that's not what they think. And what I think they should not be doing and what I regard as evil, they don't seem to think that it's evil. So what exactly is good and evil? And I started doing research on this and so on. And what was surprising to me, at least, was how indifferent they were to the wider question of what's good or evil. It was, well, everybody knows that already. And well, how does everyone know it already? Well, they've been told what it is it's the good is some version of living for others. Who are we to question that? Who are we to think about that? And it is much harder to think about morality and to challenge it. But in the end, I think of it as a tribal phenomenon as well, because in the end, it's just something that's handed down to you or passed on to you, which you're not supposed to think too much about. And so what individualism is, in a deepest sense, then I think is thinking about these issues. You can put it widely as there are issues about morality, because there's a way in which you can think of religion as it's the essential thing that it's doing is trying to inculcate values. But if you think of it in terms of religion and morality, of a willingness to question these, and a willingness to question them at a very deep level. So I'll put up here, I put these as inspirations for an individualist, and these are particularly, they're inspirations. I find these stories and people inspirational. So I put up here Galileo, Socrates, and the Fountainhead. And there, if you think in the West, these are thought, I mean, Galileo and Socrates are thought of as exemplars of individualism, and I think rightly so. And I would put the Fountainhead, that this is, should now be regarded as a classic novel of individualism. And the story of Galileo is someone who's challenging religious tradition. But I think part of to get what's important about the story is he's not challenging religion in order to tear it down. So there's a lot of people, and I think particularly in the contemporary world, who what they love to do is knock down religious arguments for the sake of knocking them down. And it's like knocking people down, like their structure of values and ideas has been shattered. And you don't put anything in its place. And with Galileo, it's the reverse. What he's on is a quest for knowledge and a quest for truth. And he's one of the discoverers of, a significant new body of knowledge about how to think about physics, how to think about the solar system. And that's what he's after. That's what he's pursuing, a real positive that he's pursuing. And the consequence is, well, look, all these religious ideas that we have and that the Earth is at the center of the solar system and so on, and it couldn't be moving because, I mean, how would we be flung off the earth and so on? And he has all counter arguments. No, that's not right to think about it like that. But the consequence is you're knocking down more tribal ideas, in this case, religious ideas. But the whole perspective is there's something better than hand-me-down ideas. What's better is reaching ideas firsthand, that you understand the arguments and the evidence for them, and then holding fast to those ideas, which is what Galileo does when he's up against the church. And the same is, it's a similar kind of issue with regard to Socrates, and indeed you could see him as he's challenging both religious and moral traditions. But it's again, it's in the name of a positive. It's a vision of, like, this is how we could think about morality. This is what it really means to take seriously ideas about what is good, what is evil, what is justice, what is courage. This is what it looks like to really think and grapple with those ideas. And the consequence is then, but it's just a consequence, that, well, if this it runs afoul of our religious traditions, but again, it's traditions. It's things that you've inherited, that you're supposed to think are true, even if you don't have good reasons to think are true. If you're really on a quest for knowledge, you start to discard these things, but you're discarding them as, I'm on a quest for a positive. These are now I'm seen as negatives, and they're not true, and I need to discard them. And that is, I think, the real perspective of an individualist. It's on the quest for a positive, and for positive ideas and positive knowledge and positive values. And the consequences, you give up all the things that you now think, well, I don't really have arguments for. I don't have really reasons to think this. These were things that I just inherited or was supposed to inherit. That is, I was told, this is what you're supposed to think. But in regard to thinking, there's no supposed to. There's only, like, what do I actually think is true? What do I actually think is valuable? And the Fountainhead then is a literary dramatization of some of these issues. And in particular, I put, there's 2 episodes in the Fountainhead that the whole story revolves around: the Stoddard Temple and the Cortlandt homes. And these actually, they end up both going to court, so they're both trials in the book, and there's that similarity as well to Galileo and Socrates. They were both tried for daring to challenge I'll put it in the end, to challenge the tribe, and it's what you're supposed to inherit. And the Fountainhead, it's part of what I like a lot about the story, and this is, Ayn Rand emphasizes this if you read the 25th anniversary edition of the Fountainhead. It's the whole vision of something positive, that there's, you can think of it as there's something better than religion, and there's something better than conventional morality. So the Stoddard Temple is a temple that the hero of the book, Howard Rourke, designs. And it's a place for reverence. It's a place for contemplation. It's a place to really try to connect with your highest values. But the whole emphasis of the book and the whole description of what he's constructed is like it's a temple that has never been seen before. Has never been created before, because it's a temple focused on the individual, not the individual kneeling in subordination to some higher power to which he owes his life and which dictates to him. It's a temple in which an individual goes to discover himself and contemplate himself as an individual. And the whole book, as she puts it in the introduction, is offering a new conception of reverence, of respect, of another term she puts, of worship, but not of worship of something above the individual, but a worship of the individual at his best. So you get in the Fountainhead a deep challenging of religious traditions and tribes, but from the perspective of there's something higher to attain. There's something better than religion. And the same in regard to conventional morality, that you get a challenging of the idea that the good is to live for others. And you get both a presentation in the story and then the conflicts really revolve around this, that it is, no, there's another view of morality that says it's about the pursuit of the individual's own life, values, and happiness. It's a much more demanding morality. It's a morality that jettisons any idea that you have to inherit things, that this is what you're supposed to value. It jettisons the whole idea of taking orders, that someone's going to tell you what is good and evil. But what it requires then is that you really think about these issues and think deeply and form a view about what is good and evil, a view that you think is correct and that you're then going to abide by in practice, and that's what it looks like to really be an individual. So in terms of inspirations for an individualist and the deep way in which Ayn Rand thinks you can and you should create the content of your character and so your own personal identity, I think these are three good things to think about in terms of what it looks like in practice and what models or exemplars of this look like. Yeah, Annie, or how much time is left? Oh, okay. Sorry, I've gone way over. Let me see. Yeah, let me make one last point, and then I'm around all the time for questions as well. This is, it's a point, because you get a kind of counterattack from tribalists, particularly when you challenge religion and when you challenge morality. And it's that you're supposed to feel guilty for the very questioning of these things. That, no, this is something you're supposed to inherit. You're supposed to subordinate yourself to. You're supposed to just accept. And that when you start to question it, you get all kinds of, like, this is wrong, and this is evil to do. And to be a real individualist, you need to push through that. And there's many things to say about how to push through that, but this you can't accept. One way to think about it, it's a kind of original sin. It's you're a sinner just for asking the questions and just for issuing the challenge. Even if they can't answer your questions or give you a good reason for why they say, like, this is what our religion is, or this is what is moral. And so, even if they can't give you an answer, what they do is they switch the blame onto you instead of them. Like, it's not their problem they can't give you an answer. It's your problem for asking the questions. And if you're going to be on a quest for an individual, to be an individual, you're met with this kind of, particularly in questioning religion and morality, of trying to induce guilt in you, and you have to have the courage and the confidence to say, so I don't accept that. If you can't give me actual answers to my questions, you're the one who should feel guilty, not me. Okay, so let me draw a line there, and we have 3 minutes left for questions. Okay, so I apologize for that. Are there mics?
Yeah, okay. I have a mic here.
So who's going to be the one and maybe only brave person?
Do we have time for 2 questions?
I have time.
Okay. Well, it's going to shorten your coffee break. That means that you'll just have to go, get your coffee, come back inside quickly, okay? So let's take 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. My question is maybe 2 quick questions. What's the difference between collectivism and tribalism? Because you said that opposite of individualism is tribalism. And second, what is the force that is pushing people into the groups? What is, if you have a tribal or collective, how comes that even if the collective has no own mind, there is this force which is pushing or pulling people into the groups?
So on the first part of the question of collectivism and tribalism, I think in the end they're the same. So it's that, and it's certainly, I think this was Rand's perspective, as I was putting it, that collectivism is dressed up as its sophisticated group worship, and that it's extolling a particular group, and it seems like it's based on ideas, and you should be convinced that communism is right, and so on. But if you look at it in actual practice, and I think when you look carefully at the doctrines. Communism was spread by the gun and by the sword. It's spread by force. We're not trying to convince anybody. We're trying to take over and rule. So what it really pushes is that the individual is incapable of thinking for himself and of valuing. And he has no value. Only the group has a value. And what tribalism is, that become really naked. So that, and what it really means. If you're, and this is what she thinks of as, this is what pushes or pulls people into groups. It's the more you're indoctrinated with the idea that I'm incapable of thinking for myself, really, and of building a life. Like in America, you didn't build that. So if you really have that perspective on yourself, and you have a perspective of morally, I don't count, I'm a cog in the machine, I'm subordinate to the group, and so on. It's a very, very uncomfortable position, because I can't think for myself, I don't count, I need someone to tell me what to do. And so I need to join some group, and that's the pull to the groups, that the group gives the person a kind of pseudo-confidence and pseudo-value that he doesn't have as an individual. But he's being indoctrinated with the idea that you can't, who are you to think for yourself? I mean, that's part of the kind of guilt here. You're asking, why do you think you can figure these issues out? And the more of that in the culture, the more it pushes people to groups, I think. Yes?
Hello, good morning. So my question is regarding, so we are all here a group, and when we are talking about going into a group or things like that, how do you think we save ourselves from this tribalism phenomena, what we are trying to learn about? Or how do you think we don't get carried away with this group thing, even though we are all in a group of objectivism?
Okay, that's a good question. And Tal brought this up. I think either Tal or Yaron said yesterday, don't be tribal. And this is, thinking of it not as a sort of like a wide cultural phenomenon, but for your own life and self, it is, you can join groups partly for good reason and partly for bad reasons. And you really need to think, like, why am I a part of this group? And if you're putting it, I don't think everyone here thinks of them as an objectivist, but for instance, I do, and I joined the Ayn Rand Institute. And you have to really think, like, am I joining this because I think it's true and I think it's right? Or am I joining it sort of to be a member of the group, and then I'm starting to be pushed to, like, I have to uphold the party line regardless of what I think, and now it's sort of my group, right or wrong. So when you participate in any kind of groups, I think it is easy, I mean, the way group think is easy. It's easy to be pulled into that, and you have to really be on guard against it, and you have to be thinking of yourself as an individual. And here it should be like, yeah, maybe some of these ideas I agree with, some I don't. I found Ayn Rand interesting, but I'm not going to think of myself as an objectivist and get way ahead of myself as, yeah, I'm sort of like a card carrier of this group, when I don't even really know what the whole philosophy is about and so on. And I think what Tal was encouraging the people who do think of themselves as an objectivist, don't be tribal about it, and don't think, oh yeah, I want to pull this guy in even though he's not convinced about it or hasn't read half of it and so on. So you need, one, to respect yourself as an individual and where you are in your thinking and what you know and don't know, and be on guard about being too easily swallowed into the group. And I think a healthy group is aware that that happens in groups and is trying to mitigate that and stop that from happening. And I hope, I mean, the tone, for instance, of this conference isn't that people feel, oh, I have to agree with everything, even if I haven't even thought about half of the things. And there's kind of some kind of presupposition about that, because that is a kind of tribal mentality. So you can get it in all kinds of groups, even groups that are better from some perspectives. You can get tribal thinking within them, and you get it within objectivism, for sure.
Thank you, Onkar.
Okay, thank you.
So Onkar will be around, and I know he loves to have questions. So now, sorry, we have 20 minutes to go and get coffee, go to the bathroom, whatever you need. But please be back in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Quisiera ver el sol. Quisiera ver el sol. Quisiera ver el sol. Quisiera ver el sol.
Everybody, please get seated. We're starting in 5 minutes, so please find a seat. Please get seated, everyone.
Oh my God. You got my notes?
No, well,
I was kidding. I guess somebody knows what I'm going to say. They can give me notes.
you seem to be always able to just wing it all the
I
time.
wing it always.
It's perfect. But I just wanted to let you know that the tape that is on the scene over here is approximately where the shot goes. So
From there to...
all the way to the end of the screen.
Well, I'm going to stay here between this table and that table. Perfect. That's what I'm going to say.
Yep.
I could try. We could have a conversation.
I like that.
Thank you. I'm gonna forget.
Everybody, please find a seat.
Wave at me towards the end.
All right, 1 minute, guys. Is he? All right, guys, let's get started. So just a quick announcement. Thank you very much for coming back into the room in an orderly fashion and pretty much within the time limit. So just another quick word here. There are free bags for everyone, and it's with a beautiful design. It's a drawing made by the sister of Ayn Rand. So they are at the registration table, and they're free for all attendees. So please grab your bag. And there's lots of displayed material from both ARI, but also from our partners in Europe. So I want to introduce to you a guy that many of you, probably all of you already know. He's played a significant role in growing the objectivist movement in Europe. He's actually the main speaker of the 300 events we mentioned yesterday, international events. I think he's done at least 3/3 or more.
I think over 200 of those 300.
Yeah.
I mean.
So 3/3, three-quarters. All right. Anyway, good. So Yaron Brook, chairman of the board at the Ayn Rand Institute, and one of our greatest speakers. I give you Yaron.
He can't introduce people as great speakers. It's too intimidating. It's like sets the bar way too high. It's scary. So, America is a truly unique country. It's unique in history. It's unique in its formation. It's unique in its ideas. It's unique in its evolution. It is why to talk about tribalism in America is so upsetting and disappointing, really, whether you live in America or not. What makes America unique? What makes America special? Why is America viewed by much of the world, or has been viewed in history by much of the world, as a shining city on a hill, to use a Reagan description? America was founded, and it was the first country, and in some respects the only country, to be founded on the basis of an idea and not on the basis of a tribe. If you think about your own countries, most of your countries, most of the reason your countries exist is because the people within that country share some kind of common heritage, belong to the same tribe, and justify their existence in terms of that tribe. America was a country that had no tribal origin. It was a product of that period that Onkar described, a product of the period of individualism. It was a product of men who had a vision for what a country should be like, for what the role of the state, the role of government should be. And that role was limited to the protection of the individual, recognizing that individuals have the right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, have a right to their own life, have a right to live for themselves, have a right to pursue their own happiness, and that the state was there to protect them, to make it possible for them to pursue the rational values necessary for that pursuit of happiness. It was a country that was founded with the recognition that it did not want to be tribal, and established institutions to try to prevent it from being tribal. Indeed, the founding fathers talk a lot about we shouldn't even have political parties because that might create an element of tribalism. We should run as individuals, not as Republicans or Democrats. Didn't last very long. The tribes formed very quickly, unfortunately. But they understood the danger. And they created institutions to try to protect from it. And it's why the United States was such a hospitable, at least in theory at least, place for immigrants. The idea was Anybody can come here, from any tribe, from any country, from any culture, from any background. And what we expect from you when you come to this country is to think for yourself, to work for yourself, to act for yourself, to be an individual. We don't care where you come from. Now, again, there are caveats, unfortunately, because at the same time as this was such a positive force, they maintained, the racism that was so prevalent of that period. They maintained slavery, and even post-Civil War, that racism sustained itself. And there was always this tension in America between that collectivism of racism and the ideas of the founding. And the ideas of the founding are what necessitated a civil war to end slavery. It was the ideas of the founding that ultimately manifested themselves in the civil rights movement to end institutionalized racism. But there was always this tension. But in spite of that, it was this amazing place that expected you to be an individualism, that called out to you to come to it if you were inclined towards individualism. And even last night, I was talking to people, and they were saying, some people were saying, yeah, my goal is to get to America, right? And of course, I'm an immigrant, so I know exactly what you mean. My feeling was, from reading Atlas Shrugged on, was I have to find a way to get to America. A land that will respect me as an individual, not as a member of a tribe. I come from a very tribal culture. All right, those of you from Israel know what I'm talking about. A very tribal culture. I wanted to escape that culture. I mean, my motivation of moving away from Israel was primarily to escape the tribalism. That you are a cog that serves the tribe. America was always the inspiration for individuals to go and pursue their own life as individuals. And it was a system that kind of reinforced that. Right? If you failed, you failed. Nobody bailed you out. It was hard. And if you succeeded, you got to keep it. It was yours. So people who were willing to fail, risk takers, people who were willing to stand on their own 2 feet, were attracted to this amazing country. Now, unfortunately, much of that has decayed. And it's decayed for the reasons Onkar gave this morning. It's decayed because of the philosophical attack on reason. And a philosophical attack on reason is a philosophical attack on the individual, because it is the individual who reasons. It leaves the individual naked, ignorant, incapable of understanding the world around them, as Onkar described it. And at the end of the day, that brings about fear. It's scary. The world is scary if you can't use your mind to understand it. And therefore, you gravitate towards groups. And of course, it was attacked by the collectivists, those who have always claimed that the group is more important than anything else. But that attack, while it was there and it was prevalent and it kept intensifying, I'd say, it really started with the progressive movement in the late 19th century, and it continues through American history, and it's why America turns and becomes a welfare state, but it never really embraces the welfare state. It kind of does it in spite of itself. America's always been a reluctant welfare state as compared to Europe, which is a committed welfare state. Right? But the welfare state itself creates the cycle of zero sum. You're getting something that's coming at my expense, which creates a group over here of those who receive and those whose wealth is taken away from, and special interest groups and cronyism. And that gets worse and worse and worse because it's not being challenged. The only challenge, the only moral challenge, the only real challenge to the welfare state, the only real challenge to the slow growth of collectivism in America was Ayn Rand. It wasn't the conservatives, it wasn't anybody on the right or anybody on the left. Slow erosion. And what we've seen in the last few decades is a culmination of that erosion into what I'd consider full-blown tribalism in America. And I moved to America in 1987, and I've seen the change and the difference just over the last 32 years. Sad, tragic. I mean, much of it comes from the left. You see it on American campuses. I know there's going to be discussion of multiculturalism tomorrow, but the multiculturalist movement, which morphed into the identity politics movement. Identity politics is what? It's the idea that your identity comes from the group you belong to. Identity politics, it's all about your identity. It's not yours. It's not, you don't shape your character. It's the color of your skin. It's the ethnic group you belong to. It's your gender. And there are, 98 genders now? So there are 98 different groups. All of those things determine who you are. It's how oppressed you've been. And on campuses today, this idea of, intersectionality? This idea of intersectionality, yeah. I mean, intersectionality is the idea of a morality that says that the needy, the suffering, the persecuted are the ones we should all be sacrificing to. It's an extension of this conventional morality, taking it kind of to its logical extreme and combining it with tribalism. Because now the idea is we have a hierarchy of oppression. Who's the most oppressed group? Who's the least oppressed group? And clearly, altruism, the idea that we should live for others, demands that we sacrifice the least oppressed group to the most oppressed group. And you have all kinds of, I mean, it's complicated, right? Like if you're a white male, it's easy. But if you're a black male, you're black, so you're oppressed, but you're male, so you're an oppressor. And this goes on and on and on. And of course, all of it is based on some truth. There's always some element of truth. If you're black, you have been oppressed. If you're a woman, you have been oppressed. If you're gay, you were oppressed, right? All these things are based on some element of truth. And what they've done is they've taken that oppression, used the fear that the negation of reason has made possible to now lump you into a group, and the group will protect you. Because you've been oppressed, your only protection is the group. So we see this, on campuses in America. Now I think it's spread, identity politics has spread to at least the UK, and my guess is to other places around Europe. We've seen this grow and intensify for decades. We've been talking about multiculturalism and the danger of it, and the danger of this, racist, tribalist mentality that the left has been preaching. What I think is not completely new, but new in its visibility and new in its scope, is the tribalism on the right. Now, it's always been there to some extent. There's always been, as we said from the beginning, there's always been racism in America. But it's gained traction and become relevant again and become something that people are not embarrassed by. There was a long time in which it was embarrassing. And now it's not. So you're seeing the kind of actions at Charlottesville that Onkar described. The chance of we will not take Jews, we will not let the Jews take over or take our stuff. And the whole idea of America being a white nation. I mean, the first time I heard that, I was like, what? I mean, America is the land of the individual. America is the land of opportunity for each one of us as individuals. That's the ideal, that's the dream. But now it's America is white nation. And people say this who don't consider themselves racist. They just say it factually and should stay a white nation. Some of you might have seen an interview I did with a black interviewer who was actually arguing that America should be a white nation. And it was I didn't know what to do because it was so shocking. And so it's like, other than call him a racist, which I did. Which was weird and interesting. But you're seeing that more and more in the United States, just taking for granted, just being accepted. This implied racism just factually being described. And again, a president who, at the very least, doesn't speak out against it, and the very worst, actually condones it. And you're seeing that reflected in things like, and I know this is a controversial topic, but things like immigration. Right? Again, America was founded on the idea of individuals come, benefit from the freedom, make the most of your life. We are here to protect your rights. And now it's about immigration is a threat because, again, we've created a tribe. And the tribe now is the tribe of America. Right? So there's this idea of America, and you're not an American if you come in as an immigrant. And there's concern about the fact that the immigrants, and again, this isn't a minor concern, it's a real concern that the people coming in to America are not white, because America might start becoming a white nation. So there's a tribe within the bigger tribe of America. There's a smaller tribe defined by the whiteness of the skin. And we just, I think Donald Trump this morning or yesterday, whenever it was, declared a state of emergency. America is under attack because of immigration. Because immigrants are coming across the border, yes, illegally, because the laws in America are so screwed up that if you want to come and enjoy still the benefits of freedom that America actually provides, the benefits of opportunity that America actually provides, you have to break the law. Big deal. I always say, if I couldn't have come to America legally, I would have found a way to come anyway, right? But it's a national emergency. People are invading the country from Mexico, right? They're going to kill us. Us. Who's us? And where this, there's no attempt to actually use reason and data and evidence to convince us. It's all, if you listen to the rhetoric, it's all about fear. It's all about misrepresentation of facts in order to induce fear. That's the tactics of tribalism. It's not about reason. It's not about thinking for yourself. I mean, because I'm pro-immigration, I've been asked to leave the country, to give up my passport. I'm not a real American because I am for immigration in America today. You even see it in the issue, which I thought was a relatively simple issue, the issue of trade. America has, it turns out, American jobs, which Americans must do. Again, this is a form of tribalism. What does that mean? America used to be the land where we wanted the best for the best price. And we didn't care where it was made. And we didn't care who produced it. We wanted the best because our focus was not on American jobs. Our focus was on our lives and how to make our lives as individuals the best lives that it could be. And in order to make my life the best life that I could be, I wanted to buy a Toyota or an Audi. Nobody cared. It didn't matter that it wasn't built in Detroit. But again, over the last 30, 40 years, you've seen the slow creeping in of you have to buy American, which I think, as Harry Binswanger in a famous essay he wrote, which I recommend, he says, buy America is un-American. American means buy the best for the price. Buy what's consistent with your personal, individual values. It doesn't matter where it was built. And America thrived on that idea. It succeeded economically on that idea. It's not like we have evidence to say that because we had free trade and because we had lots of immigrants coming in and because we are relatively free to make our own choices, we somehow suffered economically. Quite the contrary. America has benefited enormously. Americans, as individuals, have benefited enormously. from this kind of trade, but we're seeing more and more rhetoric around trade that is pure tribalism. My tribe built it, and therefore it's good. And if your tribe builds it, it's bad. The whole notion that countries trade with one another, like America trades with China, like who's America? What did they buy exactly? I know I trade with some Chinese guy in China. I buy iPhones, right? Always use my iPhone, which was, assembled in China. And I bought it from Apple, and Apple bought it from Foxconn, or paid Foxconn to assemble it and bring it back. But where did America fit in here? How many countries contribute? Some of you know this. How many countries contribute to the companies from different countries contribute to the making of this phone? I think it's 40, 60, something like that. Who cares? It's a phone. It's great. It's amazing. And everybody across the supply chain has benefited from the fact that I bought the phone. But I bought it for me. I didn't buy it because it was made in America. It's because it was beneficial to my life. So much of economic language has become tribal, collectivistic, nationalistic. And I think the reasons for all of this are what Onkar described and what Ayn Rand wrote about. I mean, everybody here, particularly those of you from the Balkans, should read Global Balkanization. And the idea that she wrote this in the 70s and described exactly what would happen in the 90s and the 2000s is stunning. It's one of those essays we read and say, no, she couldn't have written it back then, right? But she explains exactly why this has to happen, given the philosophical foundations, given the attack on reason, given the attack on individualism, the elevation of emotion and irrationalism, and the elevation of the collective. So America today, I think, is in big trouble. Big trouble. Not because of economics, but because of the shift towards tribalism, which feeds on itself and makes itself worse because the left responds to the right and the right responds to the left, and they both become more committed to their particular tribes. There's very little thinking, individual thinking. There's very little independence. There's which tribe do you belong to is now how people evaluate you. You can't, for example, as an objectivist be, well, I agree with the Democrats on some things and I agree with Republicans on something, and mostly I disagree with both of them on pretty much everything. That, people can't even, you have to choose. It's this one or that one. There's only two choices. You can't make any other choices. And again, that's a tribal mentality. There's only this group or that group. You can't be yourself. You can't think for yourself. So America's in real trouble. And, everybody wants a political answer. And the political answer does not exist. The answer is a rebirth of individualism. The answer is taking the individuals, taking their lives seriously, taking back ownership of their own soul, of their own character, of their own life. And individuals who have that attitude don't want to belong to a tribe, reject the idea of tribes, and therefore reject the idea of an all-encompassing state dictating to them what they can and cannot do. So the solution to both the economic issues and the tribal issues is philosophy. It's retaking our soul back. It's retaking our lives back as individuals and rejecting this whole notion of tribalism in America, in Europe, everywhere across the world. Thank you all. So we're going to take questions.
We're going to take questions over here, please.
We got a mic over here, so if you move over to that mic.
We can take a first one from Vinny here.
Yeah, let me just pitch my website, YaronBrookShow.com. My YouTube channel, subscribe. And what else? Follow me on social media. Of course, you've got all the Ayn Rand Institute content is amazing, so consume it. The website, particularly, the YouTube channel in particular right now, there's so much amazing content going up on that website. There's Ayn Rand lectures, there's Leonard Peikoff lectures, and then there's a lot of the intellectuals from the Ayn Rand Institute are represented now on the YouTube channel. So subscribe to Ayn Rand Institute YouTube channel. Yeah.
Hi, Yaron.
Hey.
So I know that this is a question that's kind of focused on the U.S., but I'm sure you can find there's an analog.
It's the theme of this call.
I'm sure there's an analog in Europe as well. Yeah. So you talked about the tribalism amongst the right with the white supremacists. Do you think that, I would say in about the last 10 years, the kind of ubiquitous tribalism amongst the left as well regarding racial minorities has kind of contributed to that reaction from the right as well?
Yeah, that's what I said about identity politics. So I definitely think that the left intellectually legitimized this kind of racial identification. They basically said, we're going to identify all these minorities, and that's going to be their tribes. And then kind of in a sense, some whites said, well, if, we can play that game, right? And now it's intellectual legit, right? So before it was viewed as racist and bad, but now it's being taught at universities. Now it's being presented as a theory. I mean, they took it out of context, of course, of even how the left presented. But yes, I think left legitimized this kind of racial politics. And now it's all encompassing. Now everybody's playing it.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the best way is to just run over to the mic, just form a line there, and we'll take them quickly. So quick questions, because I think there's going to be a line. Right. I saw somebody else there with their hand. Just go. It's not that big of a deal. Yeah.
Morning. So prior to 2016, it seemed like the dominant tribal element on the right in America was religion. What happened to that? And what can we expect? Is it gone or is it coming back?
So, yes, I mean, we have been warning about religion for a long time, particularly on the right. Leonard Peikoff, of course, has spoken a lot about the threat of religion in American politics. It hasn't gone away at all. I would actually argue that much of this tribalism is reflected, I think, in Donald Trump's presidency, is a consequence of that religious mentality that has been growing and growing. Now, again, I don't want to offend anybody, but if you've got questions about religion, I'm happy to answer them. But I think that one of the identifying factors about religion is that it is authoritarian in its epistemology and its ethics. You're supposed to do what's right because you're supposed to do what's right, because it's written in an ancient book or because some preacher said so, some interpreter of the book says so. It's commandments. It's authoritarian in that sense. You don't get to choose. You don't get to understand. You don't get to reason why you should do it. And the same thing epistemologically, in the sense that truth comes from a book. Truth comes from revelation in some sort. And it instills an authoritarian mentality, right? And I think that authoritarian mentality now dominates much of what you'd call the religious right. And then they're willing to vote for somebody who's not religious, who's authoritarian, who reeks authoritarianism, Donald Trump, right? Because Donald Trump, what was surprising in the American election in 2016 is that Ted Cruz ran a very focused campaign on evangelicals. He ran a religious campaign. He focused on them. He wanted their vote. But the guy who was the least religious candidate in all of them, at least in his life and the way he behaves, but the most authoritarian in the way he presented himself, is the guy who got the evangelical vote. I mean, Donald Trump won South Carolina over Ted Cruz, over Huckabee, over people who are far more religious than he is. Because I think for them, much more important than your religious affiliation is this idea that you can solve problems, you will just do it. You will get it done, which is Donald Trump's kind of shtick, right? And I think that is why the religious right voted for him. So I don't think religion is gone. I think it'll come back. You know, as explicitly, it shapes very much the thinking and I think the epistemology and the way people view the world among voters in America.
Thank you.
Hello, that was an excellent speech. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but the saying goes like, I would sacrifice myself for my brother, for my 4 cousins or 16 second cousins. And it goes along with the fact that tribalism is somehow kind of coded into our DNA. I mean, Richard Dawkins wrote a book, Selfish Gene, that he explains basically on the gene level, we want to preserve something which is closer to us. So how do we fight something which is very much connected to our existence, and it's very much the survival method of evolution?
So I wouldn't sacrifice my life for any of my cousins. I wouldn't sacrifice my life for all of my cousins combined. I just wouldn't. I like my cousins. I mean, there are like 3 people in the world, 4 people in the world. I would literally, give my life for my wife, my children. But not my cousins. So I don't think it's coded. This is exactly what Onkar was talking about. This is conventional morality. It's coded only in the sense that it's the morality that we've all been, that's ingrained in us culturally, that our preachers and our philosophers and our teachers and our mothers have told us that this is what you're supposed to do. Family is everything. No, it's not actually. I love my friends much more than I love my family. And I include my brothers and sisters and my parents. I mean, I love my parents, but you know what? If I had to help my friend, a really close friend, or my parents, I would help my friend first. Because I've chosen my friend. I didn't choose my family. So the elevation of family is one of the ways in which we inculcate this tribalism. And, you can see that conventional morality, this idea that your life is not yours, your life belongs to, that's where it starts. It's the most reasonable group of people that your life might belong to is your family. So you start with that sacrifice, and then you expand it and expand it and expand it until it includes the whole tribe. I disagree with Dawkins. I disagree with all the kind of evolutionary psychologists. They've taken evolution in a very bad direction in terms of claiming that we don't really have free will, that don't choose our own values, that we don't choose our own ideas, that somehow there's coding that determines this. And I'm just an evolutionary freak because I happen to have different genes, I guess, than everybody else. But I think that I used to believe when I was young, that I would jump on a grenade pretty much for anybody, if they were in my tribe, the Jewish tribe, let's say. But I learned new ideas, I changed my values, and now I'm not jumping on the grenade for many people. And I used to be waiting for the grenade. I mean, literally waiting for the grenade so I could jump on it and be a hero. And it's gone because I changed my ideas. I'm not predetermined. You're not predetermined. You're not just a collection of genes. You have control over your own life. You get to make choices about the values you have. You're not predestined to just be conventional, which is that approach.
Okay.
Hi there. So you spoke a lot about United States and its current shape and the trends. I do see that a lot of people, in generally speaking, broadly speaking, liberty movement, have a bias towards hating their government the most. So I wonder, what's your stand? Because I'm, I think, quite typical IT startup guy who immigrated to London.
Yeah.
And I thought about it as a point before going to States, because I always was also drawn to these ideas it has in founding. But now, the question is it really worth it? I mean, London's also great in opportunities. So what is, except for hating your own government, your own tendencies, what is the point that you think is a future for states? And is it still the best place for opportunities and life of individual?
I think in many respects it still is the best place, which is sad, I think, a little bit, because it's deteriorated and the rest of the world has gotten better. Much of the world has gotten better, but not better fast enough to overtake it. I would love to be able to tell you, no, there's this better place, right?
Yeah.
But the difference has shrunk. So if I were evaluating where to be and I was in London, you know, we'll see what happens March 29th. But if I was in London, you know, in ranking the countries that you could go to, a lot of it has to do with your particular profession. A lot of it has to do with your particular lifestyle and what you want to, you know, how you want to live. Like I've become a huge fan of New Zealand, but you can't, not everybody can go to New Zealand. It's like really far away, and you can't see your family, and you know, it's really hard to travel to. And there's not a lot of job opportunities there. The beauty of the United States is the sheer size of it, the diversity, the ideas, the opportunities are still almost endless. Silicon Valley is still this amazing place, which in spite of a politics of tribalism, they're unbelievably individualistic. It's this real, I mean, Silicon Valley is a whole analysis in and of itself in terms of the gap that exists between how they act and how they behave and how they do stuff on a day-to-day basis and the politics that they espouse. So I still think that, particularly if you're in tech, that the best place in the world to live is America. But of course, we're making it, as Americans now, making it very hard for you to come.
It's really hard, and London also has a lot of great
London's a great city. So it's a great city.
Okay, so still?
I would still, you know, I'd still say America's the place to go, yes.
Cool.
And we need you, because the battle, you know, you have to sacrifice for the cause, you know.
Sure.
I'm kidding.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.
Make them really short, because we're running out of time.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to ask you about the evolutionary psychology, like the question that was asked before. But I was wondering about what are your thoughts on the future of humanity? Are you optimistic? I mean, knowing that humanity is so invested in the ideas of...
So we're short on time, so let me cut you off. So evolutionary psychology, ask the philosophers. You heard a little bit of what I think, but I think you should ask tomorrow, particularly Ben and Greg. Greg today is going to talk about thinking. So there's some good questions there to ask. I think evolutionary psychology is much more complicated, complex. There's something there, but what there is not what they claim there's there. That is, clearly there's something about human nature that comes from evolution, right? But then the question is, what is it? And how do we define it, and how do we address it? But your ideas do not come from evolution. And therefore, your values don't come from evolution, because your values are shaped by your ideas.
So are you optimistic that the world is becoming...
Am I optimistic? No and yes, right? So no in the short run. I'm pessimistic in the short run. I think in the short run, in terms of politics, in terms of directions, of freedom, I think it seems to be collapsing. I think there's real challenges. I see, you know, even Asia now turning against the ideas of freedom, which they seem to be moving towards. I see Eastern Europe becoming more tribal, in spite of the fact that they seem for a while to be moving towards more freedom. But overall, I'm optimistic. I think good ideas win out in the end. I think, you know, if the good ideas are out there, and if we keep doing the work, and if we keep talking to people and educating people, I believe in free will. I believe people can change, and they can change fairly quickly. So in the longer run, I'm very optimistic. And even in the short run, I'm pessimistic about all these political stuff, but I think there's this island of sanity and that's intriguing in terms of how we use it, which is technology. So I'm intrigued by the fact that we now have these technological tools that have never existed in human history, nothing close to it has ever existed in human history, and how we can use those tools to spread good ideas, basically, and to implement those ideas in ways, and creative ways that I think exciting. So the extent that I'm optimistic, it's about tech, and it's about the long run. And to the extent I'm pessimistic, I look at politics, and I look at the political drift in the world right now.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you again for your speech. I would like to ask you, when you mentioned in your speech Apple and your phone, it took me to think about one of the biggest challenges we have nowadays, which is the environment and the environmental destruction. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you perceive individualism and objectivism in relation to trying to save our environment? Because it was caused by our selfishness.
Yeah, so let me, I mean, it's, I just came from a tour of the UK of high schools. I spoke to 10 high schools in the UK, and this is the dominant question I got. I mean, over and over and over and over again. And young people today are terrified because the environment is collapsing and we're all going to die, according to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in exactly 12 years. And I'm sorry, I don't get it. We live in the best environment ever in human history. The water's never been cleaner. Never been cleaner. In any period in human history. You know why Europeans drink beer? I mean, the real reason. It's because the water was too polluted, so they had to come up with a different... Why did Chinese drink tea? Because they had to boil the water. The water was so polluted, they had to boil it before they drank it. The air is cleaner than it's ever been. And it's only going to get cleaner as China becomes rich and cleans up its environment. Because first you have to get rich, and then you clean up your environment. The human environment, which is my focus, is what it's like to be human in this world right now. It's never been better. And I know you're all shaking your heads, because I know that this goes more against convention than anything else we're probably going to say, which is kind of strange in and of itself. But the world is amazing in terms of the environment. You know, and okay, so it's warming. Let's say it's warming. I'm willing to concede it's warming. Then we have the capacity as reasoning beings to solve whatever problem comes at us. I'm not worried about warming. I know that people will solve problems. Amsterdam is below sea level. There's a dike built, I don't know when, a long, long time ago, that prevents Amsterdam from flooding. I'm pretty sure we could figure out how to prevent other places from flooding if it came to that. If it got warm, I'm pretty sure we could figure out technologies that would cool our lives, because what's important? It's our lives. The idea that the world's going to end, you know, it's almost like here's my evolutionary psychology, almost a human need to believe that the world's going to end soon, because it seems like every generation believes that they're doing something that will end the world. It's probably connected to tribalism somehow. I'd have to think about it. But it's just, I just don't see it. Like, you know, that is the last thing I worry about right now is the environment, because I've seen how much cleaner it gets. I mean, anybody visit London in the 70s? What a dump, right? It was filthy. It was filthy, really filthy. And now it's clean. And you go in America, city after city. We just had a conference in Pittsburgh, one of the cities that was considered the most filthy in America. And it's beautiful. It's clean. They cleaned it up. Why? Because we are rich enough to clean it. China will get rich enough to clean its environment for human beings. And the global warming stuff, you know, why, you know, sort of warm? You know, one of my favorite lines is Canada will become habitable. As will Sweden, you know. But the point is, we use human ingenuity to solve these problems instead of panicking and fearing and wanting to coalesce around groups in order to, or coercion and force in order to solve the problems. I want to unleash the markets and unleash human freedom and human ingenuity on the problems to the extent that they affect individuals. That's how you get the best results. Okay, last question.
Thank you.
Okay, hello, the last one. I would just ask you about, because I spoke many times to the radical leftists, and I see that mechanism that they use is very similar that was mechanism used by fascists or communists. They take something that is true, for example, the racism exists and this problem, because the white privilege, because the white man or something like this, and they add the ideological extent to this. I want to ask you, did you have this the same feeling about the radical leftists or the radical rights, or how to prevent this radicalization?
Yes, I mean, I think every set of ideas, good or bad, starts with some element that is reasonable, that is semi-true, and then builds, you know, a lot of bad stuff over it. And certainly much of the left, much of the feminist movements are built on some grain of truth, right? I mean, women couldn't vote 100 years ago in most of the Western world, and couldn't inherit wealth, and there were a lot of discrimination against women, right? And the same is true of certain ethnic groups and certain people of colored skin. So they start with that. And then they perverted and distorted and built a whole theory about it. And that's true, I think, of every set of ideas. It's not like Marx, when he wrote Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, was completely detached. I mean, a lot of what he says is true. You read the book and you say, yeah, that was happening. And then he comes to these weird conclusions about it that don't make any sense. But he starts with an element of actual reality, of actual truth, and builds on that. And I think, I think that's true of every set of ideas. Otherwise, it's dismissed very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
So our next speaker is Dr. Nikos Sotirakopoulos. He's a lecturer at York St. John University in criminology and sociology. He published a book in 2016 about the rise of activism, and in September, very exciting, a new book is coming out that's actually on this topic, tribalism. So,
thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. So, having spent the first 29 years of my life as a left-wing tribalist, okay, I'll just hold it. So having spent most of my life as a left-wing tribalist, I could sympathize with a lot of things that Yaron and a lot of things that Onkar said this morning. So before I proceed in discussing today's tribalism in European politics, I just want to begin with a very short historical overview of some key moments in European history, some key moments that made Europe what it is today. And I want us to think, what is the common thread? What is the common theme in these big historical moments? So, for example, we can see from the 16th to the 18th century the religious wars in Europe, costing the lives of more than 10 million people. And these were people who mostly believed on the same God, but they just worshipped and interpreted this God differently. Or they followed a leader who supposedly had a kind of a privileged contact, a privileged relationship with the divine. Or we find ourselves in the 19th century, and we see Karl Marx inspiring one of the most popular and most lethal movements in history. And the way he interpreted history is that history is not created by individuals. History is the result of class struggle. History is the result of a struggle between different groups. And he said that basically these groups view the world differently based on the relationship to the means of production. Not based on their mind, based on the relationship to the means of production. And his views have acquired the status of a science. And until today, they are treated as science by big parts of the academia in Europe and by many intellectuals. In the 20th century, we find the Nazis. They have a slightly different collectivistic view. History is not decided by the struggle between classes. History is decided by the war between races. And your life and what your life adds up to is basically defined by your race. But if you think that all this is a dark history of the past, let me remind you that during my lifetime, in the 1990s, we had the wars, the civil wars in Yugoslavia. And these were wars with people giving their life, not so that they can live in a state that protects their individual rights, but so that they can live in a state that kind of expresses this kind of ethnic allegiance, or in a state that expresses an imagined or real historical continuity. But too many Balkans here, danger zone, so I'll proceed kind of to the next conflict. Because we also had cases like the Basques or the Catalans, or the tensions in Northern Ireland, creating strong passions and political divisions. Now, if we pause for a second here and try to think, what is the common thing? What is the common theme between these examples? We get a very good understanding about what tribalism is. Tribalism is a way through which you view the world and you view yourself by belonging to a group. This is how you make sense of the world. And it quickly becomes clear that tribalism is the result of giving up two things. The first thing you give up is your reason, your mind. Take, for example, religion. Religion tells you you cannot understand God. You cannot prove God. You have to believe. You need to have faith. This is another way of telling you, give up on thinking. It's futile. Or think about Marx. Marx, it's supposedly the scientific kind of trend of tribalism, tells you, your ideas, the things that you have, the things that you think are your individual interest, are basically your false consciousness. So you don't know what is true for you. I do. Now, the funny thing is that people who usually tell you that you have a false consciousness are the people who are basically wrong on every last issue on planet Earth. But anyway. Or think about, I will take the examples of hooligans, because the thing I, quote, like about hooligans is that it's tribalism stripped of any ideological pretension. So what does the hooligan say? The hooligans say, we need to go and attack the other tribe. And if you ask why, what do you mean why? Because they are the other. And nowadays, we have a very interesting trend in hooliganism. Hooligans from country A align with hooligans from country B, let's say country A, Greece, country B, Serbia, based solely on the color of the team that they support. And then they might travel and engage in kind of street riots that sometimes end to deaths based on this naked tribalism. And you might say, but this makes no sense. But they have an answer. And this is a saying which is quite popular among hooligans. It goes like that. It says, for those who understand, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't understand, no explanation is possible. I think this could be the best creed of tribalism, because it tells you have to kind of sense it. I cannot explain. You either get it or you don't get it. So put differently, with a philosophical assault on reason, and this has been already mentioned, in the last century, a gap was created. Because now, how am I to make sense, not only of my life, not only of the world, but how am I to make sense of very specific historical examples? For example, during the civil war in Yugoslavia, how are we, Greeks, to interpret this war? 98 or something % of Greeks fanatically supported Serbia. Can you guess why? Is it that we've put down the facts and see, okay, let's see who is right? No, we pray like that. Serbs pray like that. We're Orthodox brothers. Therefore, unquestionable support for Serbia. Now, I'm not saying here that Serbs were the bad or the good. My problem is the method through which we decided which part of the civil conflict we will support. So if we think about it, tribalism provides the wrong answers to very valid questions. Questions such as, how am I to make sense about what is happening around me? So what is the political situation in Europe today? There are mainly two camps, a rising nationalist, tribalist, and populist right, and a moderate, middle-of-the-road center-right and center-left, like the Merkels, the Macrons, the Modis. And usually the line that draws the battles are issues such as immigration, multiculturalism, and the European Union. And recently something called globalism, which I still haven't understood what exactly it is and how it's different from globalization, but it's kind of a lingo of the populist right. And somewhere there's also the left, right? The left sometimes leans towards the populists, but quite often when push comes to shove, because they haven't got really any ideas and a vision, they go with the status quo. We saw this in Greece, for example, with Syriza. When they ran out of money in the banks, suddenly they became best friends with Angela Merkel. We saw the same thing, and we will see the same thing when, because it's a when, not an if, Corbyn becomes a prime minister. You will see that he's going to be way less radical than he appears. But we could be discussing left-wing tribalism for an hour. If I were a bit more arrogant, I would say, just read my book. Now, the problem with this scheme is that in the imagination of many mainstream commentators, there is this war in Europe between the irrationalist, backward-looking right and the reasonable, internationalist, kind of centrist status quo. The problem is that there is tribal thinking in both sides. Both sides engage in tribal thinking, but it's slightly different. For the right, tribalism is a quest for identity. For the center-left and the center-right, because they have no idea, they have no principles, tribalism is a way to hold them together. They need something. So for example, if you say, I support, let's say, Labour, and you support Tories. If we haven't got major differences, we need to find something to justify that we are this kind of lethal political enemies. And this is the way tribalism plays. Now, just let me give a clarification. most of European populist movements do not have a clear ideology. So it's not like the old Communist Party that you could read the manifesto and it could explain what they stand for. And mostly they're based on single issues, on simple slogans, such as, for example, immigration or the European Union. And in this, of course, they remind us of the left. I don't know if you remember Occupy movement. Their #1 slogan was, we are the 99%, you are the 1%. Simple as that. Also, I claim it's analytically wrong to see the new tribalist right as simply a continuation of like skinhead street thugs, street fighters of the 80s. Because they have many different characteristics today. For example, they have a different approach to LGBT issues or to racism. They condone them and they have a different kind of view on that. But to the extent that some of these groups on the right have some ideas, I think that these ideas can be specified. And there are ideas that have their root in the 19th century romantic anti-capitalism. Because romantic anti-capitalism does not come solely from the left. It comes from the right. It's this idea that, what is the society of the individuals? This is not good, because what happens to the collective? If you live a luxurious life, how are you going to fight for your country? Also, we see themes, for example, and thinkers such as the French identitarian Alain de Benoit, or we see themes from the Russian nationalist Alexander Dugin, or someone who most of you might know, Steve Bannon. Bannon has rediscovered himself touring around Europe and being kind of the ideological guru of people like Le Pen and of people in the new right. Now, what I will claim is that the tribalist right are people who paid a lot of attention at school. They took their teachers seriously. They took their lecturers and their professors at the university very, very, very seriously. And they've done their reading. Because here are some main themes of the new populist right. And I want you to tell me, have you heard these things before? Have you heard these slogans before? Theme #1, unrestrained capitalism is alienating. Theme #2, modernity and industrial society have taken away the sense of community and the sense of tradition. Theme #3, we are estranged from the environment and from nature. Theme #4, globalization and transnational institutions are just means towards the spread of, quote, neoliberal capitalism. There's this guy called Paul Joseph Watson who has hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube. He refers to Hillary Clinton as neoliberal. It's like, that's weird. Like, Hillary Clinton wakes up in the morning reading Hayek and goes to bed at night reading Capitalism and Freedom. Theme #5, individual rights is a limiting notion, because individual rights do not take into accordance the rights of the groups. In this case, of course, the group is the nation. And theme #6, identity is the defining factor creating social support. And here I quote a group called Generation Identity. Now, these 6 themes, where have you heard them before? What other movement? Yes. The left. Yes, these are exactly the themes of the new left. Some of them, there's a different terminology, but this is exactly the tune in which the left sings. I will, sorry. I just need some water. So, how can we explain this similarity? We can explain it because we are bombarded by these ideas that we can only make sense of ourselves through our identity, that we are shaped by our environment, so our environment kind of makes us who we are. And an example that comes to mind here is not from Europe, but it was the Kavanaugh case in the United States. You had so many people saying, as a woman, of course I don't know what happened, but as a woman I believe her. Or you had conservatives saying, oh, you know what, Kavanaugh is the father I wished I had, so I clearly believe him. Believe based on what? Based on this thing, based on faith, based on the fact that I have something which is common with this guy. On the very basic perceptual level. I have something there, this guy has something there, therefore I believe him. Now, the tribalists of the right just took these very, very popular ideas and just gave them a conservative spin. Now, who do these people find on the other side in the political arena? They find the European political elites who run away from firm beliefs and principles, and whose mode of operation is what Ayn Rand called anti-ideology. Anti-ideology means we're not based on principles, we're based on the short-term pragmatic whatever works. So the creed of anti-ideology would be whatever works, as far as enough people believe that it will work. And we see this all the time with the European Union. We're going to keep bailing out the Greeks. Nothing is going to change in the Greek economy, but if we believe strongly that the Greeks are going to kind of turn this around, it will happen. And my claim is that anti-ideology, despite having as its root a sincere belief to overcome tribalism, sooner or later is going to give rise to new tribalisms. And we can see this again with the European Union. The European Union was established on the idea that we need to overcome the nationalistic tendencies of the past. And again, this was sincere. I'm not saying it was not sincere. But if you see what are the principles, or maybe the non-principles, that its operations are based, we see why this is completely futile. For example, the European Union is based on simple themes like mixed economy, welfare state, diversity, and multiculturalism, but most importantly, technocratic policy making, which is delegated as far as possible from the individual. Because the way they view people is, look, you people, no offense, you're all kind of ignorant masses, so you need to let us, who know better, decide the important things for this continent. So in a way, the European Union was a project to insulate even national politicians from the responsibility of having strong beliefs. And you see it now with Brexit, right? You see that the Brexiteers who are so passionate about Brexit, when you ask them, how do you view UK out of the European Union? What is your economic plan? They haven't got any. Because the European Union was this very convenient way to hide this lack of principles and this lack of ideas. The problem is that if we apply these non-principles, sooner or later, problems will arise. For example, the Greeks are saying, look, since we're all a family here, and since the European Union has this supposedly solidarity principle, the Germans need to put their hand deeper in their pocket and bail us out. The Germans are saying, and if you ask me, justifiably, we've had enough of bailing out the Greeks. So who is right here and who is wrong? The thing is, if you go by principles that say, for example, that property rights are defined in this way, and if you produce it, you can keep it, or if you haven't produced it, you can't keep it, we could say, yeah, this side is right, this side is wrong. But the problem is that on the absence of these principles, what we have is what Yaron said, more and more groups who fight each other based on the notion that they are vulnerable, right? So, for example, now around 2012, we had this idea of the South. The Spain, Italy were the South, and we need stuff, so the Germany needs to bail us out. Now, the last thing I want to say about tribalism in Europe is this weird phenomenon where, because you haven't got real principles, you identify yourself by opposition to someone else. And this basically means I don't know what I stand for, but what I do know is that the other tribe is wrong. And therefore, I oppose them. And again, a perfect example here is Brexit. Side one, you have people with complete disregard for individual rights and people who believe in interventionist state. The second party, exactly the same. So you have people who agree that individual rights are to be violated, but they fanatically fight each other on whether these individual rights are going to be violated in Westminster or whether they're going to be violated by a bureaucrat in Brussels. Now, why did I focus on the similarities between tribalists of different political movements? Of course, I'm not claiming that, let's say, a racist thug is the same as an elitist Remainer in the UK. But the reason I did this comparison is to show that tribalism hasn't got its root in politics. The roots of tribalism are in philosophy. And this is a philosophy that is telling us that the world out there is too scary, and you can't make sense of it. And people take it seriously. People say, well, if this is the case, then I cannot think for myself. And if I cannot think for myself, I don't want to have the responsibility for my choices. So this is a society that is in Europe that because of these ideas, more and more is sliding towards a situation where your life is the responsibility of someone else. Not of the society, because the consensus of what is society keeps collapsing. So now it's more and more a responsibility of the tribe, which is even worse in a way. And my last point would be that if we think it this way, what actually tribalism is a dread, is a fear for the responsibility of thinking and make your own judgments and taking life in your own hands. Because it's a symptom of the ideas that are telling us that to think for ourselves is alienating. If I think as Nikos and not as a Greek, then I'm alienated because I lose kind of my contact with my fellow Greek Orthodox brothers. So what do we need to do then? What we must say is that actually no, the responsibility to think, and it's a very strong responsibility, sometimes it's very difficult, but the responsibility to think for ourselves and to make up our own minds is actually what makes us human. Not only it is not alienating, it's exactly the thing that makes us human. So at the end of the day, to fight against tribalism is to fight for more reason and more individual autonomy. Thank you. Just to say also a big thank you to Greg Salmieri and Razi Ginsberg, because they helped me kind of to clarify my thoughts on the issue.
So we have 15 minutes for questions, so please line up over here. If you have questions for Dr. Sotirakopoulos.
No Balkans with questions? That's disappointing. I didn't trigger you enough.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
So you said something about Corbyn becoming a prime minister.
Sorry,
I would like to ask about that. That's a scary thought.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You said something about Corbyn becoming definitely the prime minister.
Yes.
Please explain why you think that Friends of Hezbollah will definitely become the prime minister, although with all the stories of anti-Semitism in his party, it looks like his tribal colluded group is collapsing.
First of all, it was a prediction, not a wish. But working in the academia and in the education in the United Kingdom, it's exactly what we deserve. Like, I don't believe in determinism, but if you see, for example, what are the principles and what are the values that are taught to kids from age 3 till they finish university, it's exactly where we're going. And unfortunately, I don't think that the issue of his support for Hezbollah is going to be strong enough to deter people. Because the idea is, look, there's this guy. First time we have someone who is an idealist. First time we have someone with principles. Now, who cares about what? People don't even know what. Like, Hamas, what's this? Isn't it the Palestinians? And aren't they the good people? So, yeah, that's another reason why Corbyn is cool. That's how a lot of people think. So I don't think that this will be a deterring factor for him becoming prime minister. Maybe the way that he's messed up the whole Brexit thing, this could be more of a deterring factor than these kind of bad ideas and his tribalism on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Would it be really cliche if I thank you for your presentation before I ask my question?
Thank you very much.
All right. You mentioned halfway through your presentation that the new right is quite different and doesn't have an ideological historical connection with the street thugs and skinheads of the 1980s. Would you mind, explaining that in more detail?
So, for example, in cases like Greece, when you have Golden Dawn, there is a clear link because these people are exactly this.
Yeah,
and
they're
that's
like
not even like a controversial statement. They intentionally promote this idea. But if you take, for example, the Swedish Democrats, or if you take Pegida, these are movements that most of the scholars would put under this kind of new right umbrella. But they clearly have a different identity in these issues. So it's like clean-cut people who say, no, we are for diversity, I believe they probably mean it because, other people get away with saying these things. So So that's why I think these are people who are new kind of identitarians. So they were not drawn to these ideas because they liked the 80s kind of street fight thugs. But they were people who said, look, everyone tells me I need to see myself through my identity. What is our identity? We are Europeans. Therefore, this is my new banner. Otherwise, I'm a good guy, but I also need an identity. So this is why you see this kind of, I could call him kind of hip, trendy identitarianism. I wouldn't put, for example, the alt-right in this category, clearly. Although a lot of people from Europe, from these movements, the Benoit, for example, had an influence in the alt-right has more this street marching, tough guys, kind of white nationalist thug kind of profile. But in Europe, I think you see different shades of the phenomenon.
Do you think this is a question of them trying to put on a cleaner face, or is it a genuine belief in their ideology?
I'm not the most, I'm not really I haven't dug that deep to tell you if they're sincere. Like, I haven't talked to these people. I wouldn't be surprised if they're sincere. Again, because the appeal of the identity is so strong that you could take someone who's not a racist, who is not like a thug, but because he wants to embrace a new identity, he will say, now I'm kind of this trendy, hip identitarian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I like your vest. It's really nice.
I like it as well. Thank you.
Hello, I'm from Balkans, but I'm not going to start a topic that you started. Right. I have a more general question.
Yes.
So I understand the principles of tribes and the dangers of that may lead, but I have a question regarding, for example, political elites.
Mm-hmm.
They're abusing their power, so they're forming a tribe, and they're abusing every individual, but they're also forming that's a kind of a group of people.
Yes.
So how to fight that group of people by not forming your own tribe? Because in societies like that, the democratic ways of dealing with stuff are not really working, for example, like elections and stuff like that. So how to fight that political
This is probably the most difficult question. That's an excellent question. Last year, I was giving a talk on identity politics, and I had some people who were like men rights activists and said, look, you told us that, feminism has gone, for example, too far. Why are you not a meninist? The problem with this is if you try to fight a tribe by forming a new tribe, then you find yourself under more kind of restraint. Because then you have to think with the party line of the tribe. Okay, then for example, if you're a meninist, you cannot say, well, women are individuals. You say, no, all women, they have now this kind of new collectivistic kind of, women are hypergamous, women are this, we live in like this feminine imperative. So you try to escape one tribe, and then you put your mind again in kind of the tribal prison by discovering a new tribe. And basically this is what's been happening. A tribe is formed, people try, sometimes with good intentions, to attack it, and then they form another tribe, and then we have to go on again. So, but it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to say, I will attack this as an individualist without forming my kind of new tribe, where again we are into this group thinking, making sense of the world attitude. But it's very, very difficult. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Michael from Israel. I know that we're in an Ayn Rand Institute and we're talking about individualism versus collectivism, but nothing is totally evil and nothing is totally pure and good. So I don't
disagree, but anyway, let's go on.
Okay. Yeah. So as I see society, it's a collective of people who creates a frame in which we can evolve ourselves, in which we can teach our children our values and progress ourselves into a better future, a better world. Like, this is the ideal society, the ideal values. And in this model, you have characteristics that are collective, that are needed by the people to be adopted in order for the collective to succeed.
Example?
Well, I need to be sure that my neighbor will not kill me.
Right. Yeah.
I need to be sure that I'm safe, that I have the same values of property rights. For example, which are not common through all cultures. So, may I ask you a hard question? If you can be the devil's advocate and say something pro-collectivism or something like that?
So here's a way to I'm not going to ditch the question, but here's a way to reframe it. Instead of saying, I want a society where there's this frame where everyone can have the proper values, why not put differently? I want a society which clearly respects individual rights and is ready to go to war, metaphorically, but maybe not metaphorically, with people who don't do that. So if your neighbor does not respect individual rights, if you have a proper state which says, look, if you don't respect individual rights, next thing you know, you're in trouble, then he can keep his ideas for himself, right? So the problem is not that we haven't got enough people who, the problem is not that we need to create a frame that everyone thinks the same. The thing is, you need a society which allows you to live your life, as you said, without having the fear of violence. Because if your neighbor thinks that the fact, for example, that you have a swimming pool now means that you owe him like 80% of your property, then you cannot live your life anymore. So I think a way to, what you said could still fit in a society respecting individual rights, with the asterisk that it doesn't mean that everyone would have to think this way. But the thing is, if you don't think this way, and you go against the other person's right, then you will be punished. So I think this is the non-tribal way to get around it.
Okay,
thank you.
Hey, Nikos.
Hello.
Hey there. So I come from Bulgaria, and I have two quick questions about the Balkans. First of all, how do you see the situation in the Balkans from a present days about about tribalism? Do you see that the Balkans are, like Balkan nations, are more tribal than compared to before? And because I have many friends who want to leave Bulgaria exactly because they are more individualistic, if we can say so, what do you think? How can we solve these problems in the Balkans, and maybe especially in Bulgaria or Greece because you're from there? And how can we create a culture, or how can we create space where we can use more individualistic ideas and develop ourselves?
So the first aspect, I think there are two sides. The one side is that in Greece, you had this deal which we gave the name Macedonia to our neighbors, and a lot of people are pissed off, but not as pissed off as they would be in the early 90s. That's one side. The other side is that last Sunday, there was a big football game between PAOK and Olympiacos, and in the PAOK stand, you could see people who were holding literally a poster with the face of Mladic. So, there are cores of people in Greece and Serbia, for example, that want to relive this thing. So if you see, for example, go to YouTube and check the songs that are for Arkan or for the Tigers, the paramilitary troops of the Serbs. Half of the comments are Greeks. But I don't know if this is like an internet or in the microcosm of football fans, or if this translates to the wider society. On what to do to, I say maybe an idea would be to point out the things in the Greek or the Balkan tradition that are in favor of individual autonomy. And this could come, for example, from our mythology, right? For example, the Prometheus. You're not going to change minds by using example from mythology, but I think there is stuff there. I think it's a mistake to see us as this kind of mecca of tribalism, because we also have a lot of elements in our culture that are very kind of pro-human and pro-individualism, if only we can find them and kind of push them the way we should. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, just a quick question. I'd like to ask, considering the situation now that we have in the world, would it be easy and even possible to overcome tribalism? And
excuse me, sorry, if it would be possible to
overcome tribalism, yeah. And what kind of the world would we have then in that situation without tribes?
Believing in free will, it's impossible to tell you what kind of world we'll have. I would view a world where we'd have flying cars and things like that. But the first part, which is it going to happen? I think, again, that's a very easy answer, but in the short term, no. Because again, working in education, I'm a bit horrified with what I'm seeing. Not specifically like on the overall kind of culture education thing. Because now also, for example, you have Hollywood, like they have trouble finding one person to present the Oscars because that person needs to tick all the boxes of intersectionality. But the good news is that then tribalism kind of fit itself. People see it for the ridiculousness that it is. So my answer would be things are either going to get worse or better. But I can't give something more specific.
Okay,
sorry for that.
Thank you.
Time for food. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. All right, guys, it's time for lunch. There are sandwiches and soft drinks and fruit in the foyer. Please be back in your seats 12:55. We start at 1 o'clock. The doors open at 12:45. Bring your things because it's going to be locked off in here.